Thank you.
The title of my talk today is Nourishing the Body Mind. Stories are good food. So, we often speak of the body and mind, and we often put it together as body mind, but often they're seen as separate. And in the teaching of conditionality, they arise together. So, they're not two distinct entities, but aspects of one living process. The body or the mind may falter or seem to dominate one or the other, but as long as we're alive, they really are arising together. But our experience often separates them. So when our body hurts or falters, it can be an all-encompassing experience. And when our mind takes over, ironically, meditators tend to say, I'm all in my head, forgetting that the head is a part of our body. So it's a kind of interesting way we separate out mind and body in our speech and in our experience. But one of the clearest ways I've seen the interplay of body and mind is through the narratives we carry about our bodies. And these narratives, I really like to think of them as stories that come from many sources, and they really hold our deep-seated attitudes and beliefs, thoughts and feelings about our bodies. And whether the story is made up of a single word, because a story can be something just like ugly or fat or beautiful, or 1,000 words that gives much more to the narrative, it exerts influence over how we see our bodies. So in reflective meditation, narratives and stories don't inherently carry a pejorative meaning. So we're not seeking to transcend them or dismiss them, these stories, but to recognize them as part of our human experience. In one view, our view, my view, maybe some of your view, liberation of the body-mind does not mean to exist in a state free of story and narratives. So one of the earliest stories I received about my body was that it should be attractive to boys, to men, to me, to my friends. The body was a means to attract attention, intimacy, love. And it was an implicit and explicit story that carried a message of objectification with it, which was really downgrading my body to just an object, not a whole person. It was something that was the status of a thing, a sexual object, a thin object, an object of friendship. But the thinness at the time of when I got this story was the main objective of the story. And I didn't know or realize, probably wasn't interested at the time, that it's a relatively recent phenomenon, thinness, mostly the 20th century, with mass media, fashion, and diet culture. But in prehistoric times, body fat was associated with wealth, with status, with health. In Greek and Roman times, a soft, proportioned body was considered beautiful and celebrated. So thin culture was and is, it's still touted to be the status of attraction and health. And it's really hard to remember that this too will pass, that will change over time, and it won't continue to be the standard of health and beauty. But at the time, in response to the thin culture, I sought out other cultures. I really had to go looking for direction on health and spirituality and a more holistic approach to the person, to the body-mind. And a lot of the traditions I encountered in the 70s and 80s offered me other narratives about the body. In New Age spirituality, which is probably a little younger than a lot of you, but the New Age in the 80s was something I got quite taken up in. is really based on East Indian Vedic teachings. And the body is often likened to a temple. And the temple has to be purified and maintained. And health efforts were directed towards achieving a state of purity. So the ideal of all natural, pure health became very big and blown out of proportion, almost to the proportion that thinness did. I mean, some of these narratives really expand and explode at certain times in our lives. And Western medicine in this narrative is often seen as a necessary evil, something that's good for emergencies, but not really to be engaged with much, best to be avoided. And I remember once mentioning to a friend that I hadn't taken an antibiotic since I was a child, kind of proudly. And her response was, "Oh, it must be really dirty in there then." And I remember I just went, I have to think about that. It was a moment of reconsidering the narrative. And, later when I went to study acupuncture and Chinese medicine, I encountered many narrative frameworks there. And one was that bodies were classified in types, 5-element types, and that each type had a shape, a color, an emotional propensity, an emotional makeup, and techniques from which you could transform much of the body and health that you'd been given into something better, higher, more improved. And while the system really did open up flexibility for me, it still carried quite a bit of implicit judgment about which bodies were preferable. So when I first encountered Buddhism, the view that I was most aware of that was different is that the body is not pure. And this was a real flip from the Vedic traditions. And it really turned that wisdom upside down. The Satipatthana Sutta describes the body in unvarnished terms: bones and skin as a sack of fluids, organs and feces, and the list goes on. And ultimately, it's impermanent. Eating is only for an ideal fuel for the vehicle, mindful, moderate, not for pleasure, not for actually any type of sensory pleasure. The body is to be restricted or limited. And while this perspective offered me something new, it also carried with it the asceticism from the early Buddhist communities, from the monastic communities, and their wisdom. But that direction was strongly a part of that narrative. So not only does our body change over time, we kind of talked about that yesterday. If you weren't here yesterday, you didn't have to be there. We all know this. Our body changes over time. But so do our narratives. Our narratives and stories, they are conditioned too, and they will evolve and change. And this Dharma talk is a story. So this is this kind of story I put together this morning about the mind and body, about the body and mind. And I want to leave you with some quotes that highlight the significance of storytelling. And in the style of our book, I'm not going to be naming sources or attributions for the quotes. And one of them is from Nelly and I, which you might be able to tell, which that's the only thing I'll say. But these are a series of quotes that I've been considering this morning. All experience is a story. Stories are the communal currency of humanity. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. We tell ourselves stories to live. The purpose of a storyteller is not to tell you how to think, but to give you questions to think upon. After nourishment, shelter, companionship, stories may be the thing we need most in the world. I'm going to end there.